Welcome to Hybris Conversations. My name is Suresh Kochatal. It is rare for an individual who spent his entire life in the corporate world to be straddling nature and the forest and conserving wildlife. But Anil Kumar Ipoor is more than that. He did his major part of education in the United States, including an MBA from the Cornell University. Later worked in the United States in a number of corporates before coming back to India and working with the likes of the Wazir Sultan Tobacco, what is called the VST, in its agriculture division. He later moved on after his retirement into various other activities, including being with the Confederation of Indian Industry in various roles. Along with that, Shri Anil Kumar Ipoor does a very important function as head of the Worldwide Fund for Nature India, Andhra and Telangana chapters, conserving the flora and fauna in both these states. Today, we are lucky to have with him on our show and we'd like to ask him a few questions. Welcome to the show, Mr. Ipoor.
Thank you, Suresh. It's my pleasure.
So the first question is, you did your entire education in the United States. You worked there for quite a long time. Can you just take us through that journey of yours in the US and your education and all that?
My going to the US was basically, I must say, almost an accident. We were living in Delhi. My father was posted there. I had just gotten into the IIT Chennai. Then one day my father said, go and sit for an exam in the American Embassy. I said, what is the exam? He said, no, just go and sit for it. So I went there, I sat in the exam. I forgot all about it. Then I joined IIT Chennai. And 2 months later, Chennai was in June you had to join. And 2 months later, I get this acceptance letters from the US. I didn't know, my father had filled up the forms for me. Then he said, what do you have to do? So you have to choose where you want to go. So in September, I left IIT and went to the US and studied there. Though my education was all in engineering and then in an MBA, from my childhood, I had an inclination towards wildlife and nature. And it so happened that in the US, a lot of my classmates and friends were also nature lovers. One of them ended up being the director in charge for Audubon Society. So every weekend, whenever we had time, we would go out into the wilds of the US. And so same thing with our summer holidays. We would take a car and go camping all over the national parks. But the issue there really is that this is basically from my childhood. We were from Warangal, very close to Pakal Lake. And at that time, the entire area was very, very thick forests and full of wildlife. And if you can read the old British hunters' books, you'll find that Pakal was the Kohinoor of hunting areas. And they would all be writing to the Nizam to get permission to shoot because that was his private reserve. And you had the Nizam's guards on horses patrolling their entire park. So once you got permission from the Nizam, you could go and hunt there. So that was their first choice. Second choice would be Kanha. So that was a kind of a legacy we had, wildlife legacy we had. So we were quite used to wildlife, nature, forests. So somewhere in our DNA, we had this love for the wildlife. So when I came back to India, again the same thing. I was working here, but every holiday I would take my children and go to some part of the India for the wildlife. That has been my connection really.
Mr. Ipoor, one of the things that quite often you are very passionate about is skilling. You studied in the US, you have seen a different kind of education out there. But out in India, the main problem that we face today is the fact that we produce thousands, lakhs and lakhs of graduates, both engineering, science and commerce stream. But more importantly, we can't seem to be finding a plumber, we can't seem to be finding an electrician or a carpenter. These people have a huge waiting list. But at the same time, you can still get a software engineer who can come in. Same time, he is not ready or she is not ready for the industry and the industry has to train them again. We have a skilling problem in India. We all acknowledge it. The Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Yojana is one attempt to bridge that gap. What according to you is the difference in the way education is given in the US and the education that is given in India? What's the difference? Because we seem to be more on the academic side, more on the learning by rote. What's your reading on that?
Suresh, the basically thing is that we are trying to follow a methodology which was probably suitable for the 1940s or 50s, and we never upgraded it to be suit modern technologies, modern industries, the way of life now. Therefore, the model which is followed in Europe and to a certain extent the US of having dual parallel lines, one for the theoretical studies which goes into engineering and all, and equally important and equally well considered is technical side, where people go for training in skills and they get all kinds of the salaries are no lesser, and they have the same prestige as anybody else does. And this is something that we need desperately in India. We find that the ITIs, the polytechnics are still teaching technologies or whatever, which are from the 50s and 60s. The equipment is antique, serves no purpose. When we were in CII, almost a decade or so ago, we had, based upon the request of, I think it was Manmohan Singh, we had adopted a lot of ITIs all over the country. I know for a fact that we in southern region adopted, in the 10s or 20s of these in all the 5 states. But not one experience was satisfactory to the company that adopted the ITIs because of the structure of the ITIs. The ITIs report to the labor department, and they were following their own systems. They would never agree to upgrade these methodologies and the skills required to suit the local industries. For example, Medchal ITI was adopted by Mira Siko and Pumps. And the person there was basically the advisory committee chairperson. But whatever he suggested or training to make them suitable for there would never be accepted by the ITIs. So after a few years, all the companies said, thank you very much, but we're no longer interested because the methodology doesn't work. But now in Telangana, we find Naveen Mittal has a coming with a fresh mind and is agreeing to that kind of a modified system here called dual skilling. The guys work for a few months, then they take a few months off and go and work in a company where the company gives him training for the skills required. And at the end of that 2 or 3 year period, if he's willing, the company will absorb him. Not guaranteed, but they'll absorb him because he's got all the skills required. This is exactly the way you have it in Austria or Germany or elsewhere. And this is what I think we need in India. We need the skill requirement training. And this can only be given by institutes that have close links with industries in those areas as to what are the requirements of those industries.
Mr. Sripur, one of the things that we see in India, India has a huge young population. 65% of our population is below the age of 35. That itself is a huge challenge because you need to provide employment opportunities for this huge population which is coming up, which necessarily might not have the skills to get a job. They have a degree, but that does not guarantee them a job. What, according to you, you did speak about CII doing roles playing in tandem with ITIs, upgrading them and working with various industries. The question is obviously beyond this, what is the Confederation of Indian Industries doing in terms of providing skilled jobs? Because that's going to be a big challenge in the days to come because you're going to have millions of people again coming out, and especially this pandemic. It has given it a break basically in terms of the job provision, but is this pandemic proving to be a chance to kind of revamp the entire structure of training and skilling so that people get jobs?
That's a very good question, Suresh. Basically, the industry has always been complaining about lack of skilled people. So almost every company, if you take an example of even a company like Infosys, they have a huge training center in Mysore. Same thing that every company has a big training center where people who they recruit are sent for training for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, which to them is a necessity, but also a high cost because they have got people they're training for 2 years, paying the salaries, but getting nothing out of that. So the question is, can this activity be moved to on a regular basis by, like I mentioned to you about that German model or the Austrian model. So while the guy is studying itself, the companies will give them training as an apprentice. And then when the training is over and his degree or license is given to him, he's ready for employment and no further things there. If I'm not mistaken, Andhra government had suggested or was wanted to pay companies certain amount of money, or they will train the new people on the skills they requirement at the cost of the government. And I think this is the movement toward the right steps. Can we identify the skills required and get the people to acquire those skills with a combination of government and the industry that requires those people there. The industry has an open hand. They are very keen to do such things. And they have been trying for many, many years, including the skill development mission of the central government and all these things there. So can we really get it moving? So that is where the issue is. We need to become a mass movement. It has to become, as you said, like a pandemic is on the wrong side. Can there be a big flood of skill development which the industry needs? If we're going to become a manufacturing hub of the world, there's no way we can do this unless we have the skilled people. And therefore, it's a prerequisite that our people get the skills to run the new machines, the new technologies, for us to get our due share in the world market.
Sripur, you wear a lot of hats, and one among them is the chair of WWF of India in the Telangana and Andhra chapters. You're very passionate about wildlife. You did speak about the early days at Warangal and Pakala and all those places. Now, the question obviously is, how is wildlife important in the entire Indian ecosystem? I know it's extremely important in terms of preserving the flora and the fauna, but how did you get involved in wildlife?
As I mentioned to you, Suresh, this was something that I was born into. Right from my childhood, we used to see wildlife. So we always felt that they were part of our life. And more you studied, more you met people, more you met specialists and scientists, you realized how important they were not only to see, but what role they play in our well-being. It is very clear that species are basically indicators of the health of the ecosystems. And we in our modern day, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about environmental protection. These are indicators. And unless we look after them, the environment is going to be not conducive to our well-being. And it is very, very critical that all of us become greener in our mindsets. We become absolutely passionate about protecting the environment. Environment, of course, includes wildlife. So wildlife is only the beauty part of it, but we need to protect the environment. And I think it's something that was inbuilt into me from my birth, but also with my exposure to my friends and colleagues in the US and in India. We found that we don't have a choice. It is our duty, bounden duty, to do what little we can do to protect this and pass the baton on to others.
Now, when you come to specific, when we talk of the WWF Hyderabad office and its activities, you do a lot of activities. I mean, I've personally traveled with you to Nallamala and the beyond that areas. Can you just highlight the specifics of what exactly WWF Hyderabad office does, the achievement specifically?
The WWF Hyderabad has been here in now, I think, more than 25 odd years. And the issue really is that what can we do? Because the WWF cannot supplant the government. We can only supplement what they do. We can guide them, we can advise them, and we can do a little bit to help the government do their job. So with that kind of a philosophy, we started off, first one, when we did a survey, we found that there was damage, tiger kills or panther kills or whatever, oxen getting killed, buffaloes getting killed, human crops getting damaged. So we started to think of compensation to the people who lost something. So we kept and impressed money with the banks in the tiger reserves, so that the moment there is any damage, the money can be immediately withdrawn without going through the whatever protocol of the government, pay the farmers or the whoever got suffered. And then when the protocol is over, the government gets the money, they can replenish the impressed money in the account, so the money is still there. That was one of, I think, a critical role which we played at that time. But we do a lot of other things. We do basically, as we believe, is education. We start education not only at the children, but also the adults and the elderly. We believe that only an educated man, educated means not necessarily a degree, but a guy who appreciates nature, will be the true protector of nature. We do education, we take them to wildlife camps, we take them for treks, we have quizzes programs, both in Telugu and in English. In Telugu, we just started this year, and I was amazed when we had something like 13,000 students from both the states participated in this quiz at the levels of school, at the individual school, at the district level, at the state level, and the mega final in the two Telugu states. And this was I was amazed at the quality of the students, most of them Telugu-speaking students, how they were able to understand and come up to it. I must say that I was very, very pleasantly surprised at the interest and the things there. I hope this becomes a movement. The English one has been going on for some years, but the English one is more urban-based and elite-based. But this Telugu one, I think, was dramatically. Then we do a lot of other things like we try to bring in technology into monitoring the wildlife and helping wildlife. There were two major ones we can think of. One was we were the first in the world to have stand-alone solar power-based pump sets bringing water from underground to saucer pits for the animals. The first one we did was in Nallamalas about 10, 15 years ago. And it was the first one in the world, entire world. And we took the newspaper people there and they published it with the photographs of all that. And within no time at all, we found many states calling us up and saying, how do you do this? What do you do this? And very quickly, Tamil Nadu, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra copied the model. So now you become a standard thing there you see. But
in fact, I've traveled with you to those places, and that's an interesting thing actually, where you have innovated because you can't carry power into the forest. I mean, people who really don't know this, you can't carry electricity into the forest, so you're not allowed to draw power lines. So you have to depend on solar, and especially during the summer months, as Mr. Ipoor was saying, the animals need water, and they would come to these ponds where the water is pumped in from the morning with a solar pump, and they would drink and replenish and then go back and maybe come back later in the night. Please carry on, Mr. Ipoor.
Suresh, the thing what we did in these pumps was we followed due study of the locations. We made an estimate and we tested how much is the delivery possible without making the well dry, how much water is required. So we were able to manage putting the right pump size, right amount of storages so that we're not going to empty the subsoil water. So it was absolutely the right size. Instead of just turning it on and letting the water go waste, we try to be very creative. We done about 25 or 26 of these. So every year, I think Srinivas and his friends do about 3 or 4 or 5. Because all these are based upon the money we can raise as donations from our well-wishers. So that money goes into various activities, including the solar pumps. Another thing we did was we tried to bring in legal specialists to help the forest department in filing proper cases against poachers. Because a lot of the cases fail because the filing of the case is not done the way it's done. So we bring specialists from Delhi and elsewhere who come and train them, and sometimes even write the Panchnama they write for the things there, so that the cases are very strong against the convicted, against the poachers who have been caught. So like this, we also have training programs for the forest staff in the Forest Academy. People go and train them and tell them there. We publish a lot of books which tells people what are the common animals, birds, etc. We also do a lot of newsletters to spread elsewhere. So there's a lot of wide ranging of activities, but mostly it is to bring education and the love for nature into people. We want somebody must take it, internalize it. It should not just be a statement of fact. You should really believe in it so that we go back and convince your parents or your grandparents or your colleagues and whoever else you are. So that kind of a missionary approach is very critical.
In fact, that brings me to the next question actually, because to do that, it is a young generation, the next generation, as we call them, the ones who are students, ones who are in the college, ones who are just out of college, who need to be taught. And these are people who live in those areas, deep in Nallamala forest. We have the Chenchu tribes. And you have also got the students in the outer periphery of those forest areas. WWF Hyderabad chapter has done a lot of activities. I'm aware. I myself came and trained, did a couple of training programs for them. So how do you look at this program? What is the larger game plan of training these youngsters to be aware of wildlife and protection of flora and fauna?
See, again, if I can go back to my childhood, my grandfather and my father used to take me wherever they went into the wildlife. And then I followed that. I took my children whenever I went into the forest. I used to take them. Then they are taking their children. So I think once you bring somebody in there and he appreciates what that is, it becomes a virtuous cycle. He keeps on doing it there. Therefore, if we can catch them young enough to go into the forests, they will become the very positive drivers to be able to convince their parents, their grandparents, their teachers, the school teachers, hopefully then moves on up the ladder to their government, the elected representatives, etc., which would then become a very, very strong force. We need to make this compulsory in schools, that schools every year spend X amount of time of the children somewhere in the nearby forests, so they can go and see what it is, appreciate what it is. Hyderabad that way, Bangalore, Andhra city are very lucky that within very short distances you have very good forests. So there's no reason why schools cannot. When we were at school, we used to have these picnics, go to Gandipet or Shamirpet or whatever it was, go in the morning, come back in the evening. Why can't they do it now? I don't see them happening at all. They can now take the children's schools to different places. And
instead of going to a picnic in a kind of a hotel or even going to a film city, I think it's far better to go to the nature and learn with that.
So this could be a thing that we need to make sure it happens. But again, here there is that, unfortunately, our schools have become more of a commercial and just shove down information, not letting the child see what he likes and appreciate what he done, find his own niche in the entire things there. I think our education system needs to give space for students. No two students are alike. Each one has his own interests, his own likings. They should find out what that is, give him a chance. And I think the right place to do that is the pre-primary schools and primary. Maybe by the time he gets to high school, the academics become more important. But at that junior levels, why can't they enjoy themselves?
Teach them about trees, teach them what names do they have, teach them about animals, what a cry of an animal is.
How many children do you think saw the solar eclipse? I don't think even 0.1% saw the solar eclipse.
Sripur, always the government and the NGOs have this love-hate relationship. Quite often the government feels that the NGOs are a nuisance in their efforts to conserve or protect the wildlife. The NGOs feel the government is insensitive, the government doesn't even wake up to the reality. So what's your expectation? How did you look at this entire, I wouldn't call it a battle, but love-hate relationship between the government and the NGOs?
It's an extremely difficult question to answer, because what you're saying is absolutely true. But I think we need to look at the picture in a holistic way. The governments of the countries or the states have their defined roles, and NGOs cannot cannot bypass them and do the role of the government. I think the role of an NGO is to supplement what the government is doing, educate them, train them, and motivate them to do what is right as per science or as per whatever it is. It is not for us to say you're a bad guy or you're a bad thing, you're doing bad things there. You must be able to convince them why that is the wrong thing to do. But science says this is how we should do it, this is what should be done, and therefore it can be done. And what we have noticed is the government is not insensitive. And our interactions with the governments of both the states have been that when we give them a proper proposal, a proper knowledge, they're more than willing to help us. I mean, you always have the one or two bad guys, but the majority of them have been extremely helpful and supportive, as long as they appreciate what you are saying and they find value in what we are doing. Therefore, I think this conflict between government and NGOs is because both sides have become too rigid. They're not willing to stretch out and shake each other's hands. So I think that needs to be done. Don't give up your basis or the rationale for your existence, but try to convince the other person that what you're saying has meaning, has value. That is, I think, very critical.
Sripur, also another fact is that you did describe the role of youngsters, you did describe the role of how school children should be educated. But for a common man who doesn't know much about WWF, the usual WWF would be wrongly associated with what we see on television, but they don't know that this is to do with nature. And how can a common man, how can a common person actually play a role in what WWF is doing? How can he or she contribute to it?
Okay, again, this is something that can only become through education. See, education cannot stop at school. It has to be a lifetime experience. And if somehow we can reach these different publics that you are mentioning and tell them what is the importance that your future, your livelihoods of this generation, next generation depends upon the well-being of the ecosystems. That if you're going to do something that you're going to damage the ecosystems, then your future is bleak. Not only yours, but the entire coming generations. And I think this message has to be given very strongly. Because at this stage of our evolution, we find that a lot of us are over-consuming what we are doing. We're leaving a much larger carbon footprint than we should do. but the reality is that there are now enough technologies, enough which dramatically reduces the carbon footprints. They're much more energy efficient, less waste, more productive, and it's time for us to accept and take over these learnings. We need to become far more green in our thinking. We have to adopt more newer technologies, and this is what we need to do in first stage. Second stage is once we understand, we appreciate these things, then we should go and see who we can influence. Can I influence Suresh? If I think I can influence him, I should spend some time with him and convince him as to what I know, and that then like that should become a virtuous cycle, and Suresh will go to somebody else and then go on and on there. But to bring all this together, they need to see some things. Therefore, I think it's very, very critical that everybody must go at some convenient time for them to this last of the wildlife spaces we have here, see for themselves, spend some time there, appreciate what it is there, and then that will help them really realize what's happening. If you tell me that the river is running dry, yeah, what it is. But if I go and see that there's no water there, only the pebbles are showing, that makes a massive difference to my perception of conservation of water. I won't keep the tap open when I brush my teeth. That kind of small things will come when I see the reality for myself.
Now, quite often, Mr. Ipu, the problem, you spoke about the problem between NGOs and the government. We also have this problem of the environmental clearances, and quite often organizations like yours get upset with the government for giving them a carte blanche to many industries to go do mining and go destroy the forest, widen the roads, do a lot of things. Development has to be there. It cannot be there. For example, the recent coal mine auction that we saw. At the same time, environment has to be protected. How do we marry these two things? Because both have to coexist. What's your view on that?
Suresh, you're absolutely right. Both have to coexist. And the rules and regulations are very, very clear and very good. Our problem comes in when they are not implemented. For example, like you mentioned mining, the rules are very clear that once you mine and the mine is over, you must reclaim that land.
The land.
This is a fundamental part of the clearance given to them. But if you go to any place, I don't think you'll see a single mine that has been reclaimed. Whereas in the US or whether in Australia or wherever it is, the last stage of when they're leaving the mine is they make sure that over the last 4 or 5 or 6 years, they reclaim the entire area so that when you go back after 5 years, you don't think it was a mine. Because they have been reclaimed it right from the starting off with bacteria and the soil, then grasses, then herbs, then shrubs, and then big trees, and bringing back in the flora and fauna as well as aviana into that area, so that within a short period of time, that entire mined area, which was like the moon earlier, becomes indistinguishable from the sun. So the reality is that we must implement the rules. We must, once you have passed the rules and regulations in our constitution and in our laws, why should we violate those things? And unfortunately, a lot of companies do violate these rules. But there again are quite a few good companies now which are doing extremely good work. For example, ITC, not now, but for the last 10-15 years, they just don't have a single line balance sheet of only profit and loss. They have a triple balance sheet. They look upon a financial balance sheet, social balance sheet, and ecological balance sheet. So they want to be positive in all of those things. Am I using less water than I generate? Am I generating more power than I use? Am I taking more greenery than I'm planting? All these things is built into the...
So when you have ITC Bhadrachalam, you plant more of, when you take out the trees, you plant more trees and saplings there.
Same thing with the power. I generate enough power from the sun or the wind or whatever it is, which is that more than what I'm consuming. Same thing with water. If I use so much water, I make sure that I save so much water through water conservation, through soil conservation, etc., which more than... But this is the policy a lot of companies now started, the triple bottom line approach. I think this becomes something that we must insist upon most companies, that in the next 5 years, next 10 years, depending upon where you are, you need to become positive in all these 3 aspects. So your social impact should be positive, your environmental impact should be positive, and obviously your economic impact has to be positive.
Sripur, you have traveled widely across many countries, and you rightly mentioned about certain countries which like Australia and Canada and all, which reclaim the land after mining and other activities also, even when you cut forest for other things and then you put the things back. What are the best practices from there which you think India can learn from? You did describe a few, but are there anything else that we might have missed out in which we can look at the West and say, okay, they have implemented it, can we do it here?
So again, quite a few learnings you can learn. For example, if you look at, say, two basic parks, say Yosemite or Yellowstone in the US and Kruger in South Africa, they're not only are they well protected, but they have a committed cadre of staff who are technically competent and based there. But most important is that the people who live in that area or surrounding area are the beneficiaries of the earnings of that park. So in our case, say we call them tribals. But do our tribals benefit from activities in the forest? Or are they just thrown out on the side and only somebody else benefits?
I think I did see the Madheshis in the Gir who are a part of it. I'm sure that there are other things also, the Bishnois in Rajasthan and other areas, and even the Chenchus in Allahabad.
Here, many years ago, you had this Tribal Development Corporation, which was supposed to help the tribals in collecting what they call the minor forest produce and get them a good price.
The gum and the honey and all that.
But unfortunately, that has not really been a success. But what I think we should be built in is that, as per some sort of a system or a law that says that the earnings from this part of forest where you are living, certain percentage of that comes to your well-being, built into the system. So if your budget of 100, X percentage will always be yours, so that the people have a commitment to protect it and improve it. The second one is that they generate a lot of income. If you see Yellowstone or Kruger, millions come over there. But it's still so well protected that if you go now, you will think that nobody comes here. The protection levels are so high that the park has not suffered in the last 80, 90 years they've been there, in spite of having millions come there. We cannot say the same thing for most of our parks. There are a few that are well maintained, but the numbers are still very low. So it's very important for us to maintain these parks and encourage people to come in there to spend money whatever it is there, so that income can go to the protection of the forests and to the tribals in that area. You see that it's amazing when you go to Kruger or to Yellowstone. It's amazing how many people are there, but when you are there, you don't think anybody else there.
It's so huge.
Not only huge, but each one maintains its distance. You don't have 20 vehicles sitting next to each other.
People don't crowd, don't play music.
And when you see a car there, you stay back. You don't go close to some other vehicle. You wait till he moves, then you go there. Like here, if you see a tiger, suddenly 20 tigers comes there. So this kind of a thing's there. So I think we need to make whatever tiger reserves become sources of not only protection, but also a source of income for the people who live there. Once you protect the people, the forest will be protected. That's Mr.
Ipoor, most of the people after they retire, they would like to put their feet up, read books, listen to music, play with their grandchildren. But I think you've been far more busy after you left the industry, and with wildlife, with WWF, with skilling, with CI, so many other things that I've been doing. Looking back, and as we end this interview, are you more happy before or after?
I'm certainly happier now because I can spend my time the way I want to. Say 20 years ago, I had to only find time after my full-time work was over. So now I have the freedom to spend, say I want to spend more time with my grandson, I can do that, or I want to spend more time in Nallamala, I can do that. So I have that freedom. But I also feel responsible that what little I know or what little I can do, I must do. So if I can help somebody or help some institution or help some industry, it is my responsibility to do it. Whether by basically mentoring people or by transferring knowledge or guiding them or something. That's why I spend time with CII and the industries there, so that what little I can do to help them, I'll be more than happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ipoor, for speaking to us at Highways Conversations. And I think you carried a diverse portfolio of activities, from your corporate life to wildlife to skilling. And I think everyone who watched this interview will understand that there are individuals like you who make a major difference to the society. Thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you, Suresh. Thank you for coming, and thank you for your good words. And I hope that you and I can do some difference to protect the environment and the wildlife.
Sure, sir.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Mr. Anil Kumar Ipoor, who traversed his corporate life into wildlife, into skilling, and a lot more. Very few individuals are as committed and as lucky to be in this field. Thank you for watching.